Both of these are obviously, true. It's just that Luke focuses on a different aspect primarily than Matthew does. Matthew is writing to Jews. Okay. Matthew is writing to a different audience. Luke is writing, to primarily Gentiles. All right. Welcome. My phone doesn't cooperate unless I look at it. Set our stopwatch so we can keep me reined in. This one should be relatively quick. You're in the middle of our Eschatology series, which is our study of the end of days. There are more prophecies about the end of days than there are about in Jesus' second coming than there is about his first coming. So God really wants us to know. When I was in college and first started studying all this, I was surrounded by people. They're like, well, no one knows. And it's all up in the air. It'll happen when it's supposed to happen. God doesn't want, And I'm like, then why does he talk about it? Why does he talk about it so much? So there's just so much in the scriptures about that season, the time of the end, which I believe we are on the cusp of. I know that sounds, I listen to myself say stuff like that. And I'm just like, that's bizarre. Like, Jeremiah, are you really talking like that? I am. Like, there are things that have happened, especially with the coming of Israel, that generation that sees that. That's the generation. And that was 70 years ago. That was over 70 years ago. It was, so that these are really significant times, especially when you look at the world in which we live. Anyway, having said all of that, what I want to talk about today, again, we're going through some of the significant passages of scripture on the end times and just clearing up a few things that I think are important to clear up. This one, I want to focus in on the Gospels, and specifically Matthew and Luke. I'm not going to talk about Mark, nor Mark chapter 13, nor Matthew chapter 10, which both, talk about some, Matthew chapter 10 is a little bit more confusing, but they both talk about some end time events. Jesus makes remarks. Jesus teaches on it, but he really gets in detail in Matthew 24 and 25 and Luke chapter 21. Those are really, really clear cut passages. John doesn't mention much about it. A couple things here and there, but like no extensive teaching and dialogue like we have here. And so I want to go with it. But before we get going, I wanted to say that would love for you to, you have any questions, message me, email me, and Jeremiah Bolich Ministries @gmail.com, or you can go to our website, and would love to do a mailbag segment on some of the questions you can ask. And hopefully they're questions I can answer. If not, I'll be like, I'm not sure, I'll get back to you. But really want to just give you some handles on some things to study. This one in particular, why we're looking at this is I find a lot of people in conversations I get into, like smart people who've studied, they, in my opinion, get confused on Matthew 24 and 25 and Luke 21. They want to look at those as the same when they're very different. Matthew 24 and 25 is almost exclusively on the sign of the end of the age. In my NIV above chapter 24, that's it. That's how it reads. Signs of the end of the age. It's when Jesus comes back. What the world's going to look like. The whole picture of that's like Jesus himself teaches on it. So that's important. Okay. Luke 24, not so much. Luke 24, we'll get to the signs of the end of the age, but much of Luke 21, did I say 24? Most of Luke 21 is focused on, especially in the beginning passages, it's focused on the tribulation and the time of punishment and the time, I don't know if you want to call it punishment, the time of AD 70 when Israel was destroyed, when, that just Rome comes in and just demolishes the place. And Jesus is prophesying about that time is coming, and he's weeping over it, of course. Then he goes into the signs of the end of the age. So not everything in Luke, I hear people sometimes and they say, well, Jesus said this in Luke. That doesn't pertain to the time of the end. That pertains to the time of AD 70. And the reason that becomes difficult or problematic or confusing is because there's a number of scholars who say, oh, all of this was fulfilled back in it was given because all of this was fulfilled back in, the first century when they could see it. That's just not true. This is the time of the end. And it's referencing Daniel, and Daniel specifically reads, this is the time of the end, like the very end. Okay. The end, you don't have the time of the end than 2,000 years later. Okay. So that's, all that just debunks that whole idea that all this stuff was fulfilled a long time ago. That's just nonsense. So I want to, in my humble opinion, so I want to walk through these together, and it's going to be kind of fun, easy to see. So let's jump right in. Let's begin in Matthew 24, and we're going to bounce back and forth. I would love to have two different Bibles, or like I have a digital Bible that you can flip back and forth and look at this. So here's the context. Jesus has been preaching and teaching, during this last week of his life, and he's in the temple every day, and man, it's awesome. But they're leaving one day, and chapter 24, verse 1 reads, Jesus left the temple and was walking away with his disciples when they called his attention to its buildings. Do you see all these things? Jesus said, I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. So basically, Jesus is walking out of the city, and the disciples are like, dude, look how awesome Herod's temple is. I mean, this place is magnificent, the gold and all of that. Man, it's incredible. And Jesus goes, do you see this stuff? It's all going to be torn down. Nothing's going to be, not one stone's going to be left on another. It's like all this cryptic, that's a cryptic statement. The disciples are like, what? So they basically get him on the Mount of Olives, verse 3. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, and they asked him a question. Okay, that's the same account as Luke. Let's read it. Luke chapter 21, beginning at verse 5. Some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, as for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down. So he says the same thing. Now, in Matthew and Luke, it gives this account of them coming and asking questions. Now, let me say this. Both of these are obviously, true. It's just that Luke focuses on a different aspect primarily than Matthew does. Matthew is writing to Jews. Okay. Matthew is writing to a different audience. Luke is writing, to primarily Gentiles. Okay. So there's a lot of, there's a lot of emphasis to the Gentile world, explaining some things about, what's going to happen in Israel and that kind of thing. That's different than, Matthew's emphasis. So whatever the motivation, they're two different letters written to two different people. They're covering some of the same thing. Matthew is heavier on this than Luke is, and Luke is heavier on this than Matthew is, on their own emphasis, that is. Okay. So you can tell what they're focusing on by the questions that are asked. So Matthew highlights a specific question by the disciples in verse 3. So they get him by himself on the Mount of Olives, and they ask, tell us when, because Jesus said all these stones are going to be thrown down. Tell us, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age? So you're like, all this is going to be, thrown down. Well, when are you coming back? Okay, this is all gone. When are you coming back? Jesus' answer is almost entirely focused on, they want to know, are you going to be here for this? Like, you're leaving? Like, when are you coming back? That kind of, like, when is all this going to be? You've been teaching about this during the week. When are you coming back? That's the emphasis for Matthew. It's not the emphasis for Luke. Luke, listen to the question. So Jesus says, all this is going to be thrown down. Verse 7, teacher, they asked, when will this happen? These stones coming down. And what will be the sign that they're about to happen? So Luke's question is different. Matthew is, the disciples are like, and by the way, the disciples asked all of these questions. Matthew just focuses different than where Luke does again. So in Matthew, they're like, hold on, the temple's going to be destroyed. When are you coming back? Are you going to be here for that? When does all this thing get wrapped up? That's their question. They also asked that whole night they talked. This, though, Luke focuses in on, which Jesus also covered. Hold on, the temple's being thrown down? Well, when's that going to happen? I don't want to be here for that. That's the focus of Luke. So as we go through Luke, he says his little account beginning in verse 8. And again, the question is that, teacher, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they're about to happen or about to take place? When's the temple about to come down? This is what Jesus says. Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am he. The time is near. Don't follow them. When you hear of wars and revolutions, don't be frightened. These things must happen, but the end will not come right away. Nation's going to rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There's going to be great earthquakes, famines, pestilence, various places, fearful events, and great signs from heaven. From verse 8 down through verse 11, Jesus answers listen, that time is coming, and that's end of times kind of stuff. But in verse 12, he says, but way before all of this, they're going to lay hands on you. They're going to persecute you. They will deliver you to synagogues and prison. This is all Jewish language. This is what's going to happen up to the culmination of the destruction of the third temple. Did I say third temple? The first temple? I think it's the second temple. This is the second temple. I didn't mean third temple. Maybe Leland can edit some of that. I doubt it. Anyway, but before all this, they will lay hands on you, persecute you. They will deliver you to synagogues and prisons. This is all Jewish language. And you will be brought before kings and governors all on account of my name. This will result in your being witnesses to them. But make up your mind not to worry beforehand. He goes on, not to what you're going to say. Words of wisdom are going to be given you. You're going to be betrayed by parents and brothers and relatives and friends. All people are going to hate you. Don't worry. I'm going to protect you. Not a hair of your head will perish. By standing firm, you'll gain life. Now, verse 20. So he builds up. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee. Let those in the city get out of there. Let those in the country not enter the city, for this is the time of punishment and fulfillment of all that has been written. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There's going to be great distress in that land and wrath against this people. Hear that language? Verse 23, there will be great distress in this land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Okay, so from verse 24 all the way back to verse 12, that's an emphasis on Jesus talking about their ministry. They're going to go out. They're going to receive words of knowledge. They're going to testify. They're going to be witnesses. There's going to be trial. And then the temple is going to be destroyed. The land's going to be devastated and people are going to be carried out to all nations. That happened 2,000 years ago. So Luke begins with this little small statement after they said, teacher, when will these things happen and what will be the sign that they're about to happen? Verses 8 through 11 is Jesus says, listen, terrible times are coming at the end of the days. But way before that, okay, when nation rises against nation and the whole world starts to fall apart, way before that, it's going to happen here in Israel first. And he talks about it from verse 12 all the way down to verse 24. Then he transitions from verse 25 to the end of the chapter, down to verse 38 on end of time stuff where it's the typical, birth pains and he mentions the rebirth of Israel in there and, all this kind of stuff that's going on that Matthew goes into greater detail on. But Luke is focused. I think it's significant. You have a significant picture of the prophecy of Jesus about the Israel and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple back 2,000 years ago in 70 AD. So that's Luke's emphasis. When you get into Matthew, different emphasis. Matthew, the question is in verse 3, tell us, when will this happen? And what's the sign of your coming at the end of the age? I mean, they're basically saying, hold on, temple's going to be gone? Are you going to be here for that? When are you coming back? That's the emphasis. And Jesus just starts right there. He just says, watch out that no one deceives you. And from verse 5, really all the way down to verse 13, it's the typical stuff that you and I hear about this passage. Nation's going to rise against nation. You're going to have rumors. People are going to come and say that they're the Christ, all these false prophets. You're going to be handed over, persecuted. It's just going to be bad. Increase of wickedness in verse 12. The love of many is going to grow cold. But if you stand firm, you're going to be saved. And the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations. nations, and then the end will come. So this is all on the end of times. But then this is a really important part in verse 15, especially in light of what we studied last week or last Tuesday. So when you see standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel. So this is really important. People take Daniel's prophecy and they apply it to Antiochus Epiphanes. And I hope you studied him and what he did during the Maccabean, time period and revolt and all of that in that general area when he came in and sacrificed a pig on the altar, stopped the sacrifices, put in this puppet priest, all that stuff happened. That happened, but that's not what Jesus is talking about. And that's not what Daniel talked about, because the Antiochus Epiphanes happened a couple hundred years before. This is a total different thing. This Jesus is going to happen in the future. So when you see standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand then that let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof, of his house go back in to get his. He just gives all these warnings. Get out of Dodge. Okay. Get out of Dodge, because there was a prophecy giving in 70 AD by Luke that some stuff is going to happen in Jerusalem. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, get out of there, man. It's going to be bad. But there's going to be a time in the end of days where Israel will not be totally destroyed. Jesus will come back and prevent it. Okay. The Messiah is going to come back and prevent it. In our day, Israel is here to stay. Israel's not going anywhere. That the days of that when they are brought back into the land, as Isaiah 66 says, and we never did cover it because I just didn't cover it. I may cover it eventually, but Ezekiel 36, 37, 38, and 39. Those are significant, even a few chapters later. But that time period of Israel coming back into the land, being born in one day, and the Gog and Magog war, which really is a merger of modern day Russia and Persia. I mean, just all that is there to be studied. It's really significant. Okay. That all of that time period and that, end of days kind of scenario stuff Jesus is referring to here. Okay. This is all that stuff is focused on the end of days. Super significant. So anyway, he explains all that in the passage. He even says some stuff in verse 22. I think it's important for the sake of the elect. Those days are going to be shortened. And again, there's going to be false prophets, false Christ. But, as lightning is visible from the east, is visible from the west. When Jesus comes back, everyone's going to see it. Now there is a reference, and I want to cover this now because I probably won't come back to it. In verse 31, and he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. That is not the rapture. That is not the rapture. Not the rapture. It could be. I mean, it's not the rapture, but it could be viewed that way, especially because there's some events that have preceded it that, you're like, oh, look at this, but no. That's not the rapture. That's his second coming, because the rapture there is a rapture, and we're going to talk about that in coming weeks. But the rapture is an unannounced heralded event where his elect are gathered. When Jesus comes back in his second coming, like actually comes back to earth, people see him and go, there he is. That's clearly what's going on in this context. Verse 30, at that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. This is not a secret event. They're going to see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of sky with power and great glory. And he's going to send his angels, and they're going to gather his elect that have been raptured, and they're coming back with him. So yes, there's a rapture. Yes, we'll be with Jesus. And I'm getting ahead of myself because we're going to talk about this later, but the rapture is not an escape out of here. It is a going away for a time of wrath that'll be poured on the earth. And then we come back with him to reign. We're not giving up the earth. Jesus is coming back. The saints inherit the earth and it'll be renewed. That's the idea. So I wanted you to understand, when you get into Matthew 24 and 25 and Luke 21, there's a very different emphasis. And Luke is primarily focused in Luke 21 on the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem in AD 70. There's a lot of, this is what's going to be happening during their time. And then he mentions a little bit about the future, but Matthew in 24 and all the way down through the rest of chapter 24, the day and hour not known and all of that, and all these three parables in Matthew 25, this focuses on a future time of the end. And this is what Jesus is talking about. So 20 minutes, that's not bad. If you have any questions, you can message me, but I'd love for you to take Matthew 13 and do this. Do this on your own. This is just read. There's no Greek stuff here. There needs to be some study of some words and such, but a lot of it's just familiarizing yourself with the context and just reading it and putting it together and outlining it. And I mean, it's very doable, but I would like you to read Mark 13, Matthew chapter 10, Matthew 24 and 25, and Luke chapter 21. Those are your eschatology passages in the gospel, and they're really, really important. I want to focus in this next video on the time of the Gentiles. He actually mentions this. Where did he mention that? This is Matthew 24, where they're going to trample on the city until the time of the Gentiles. Was it Luke? He mentions that. I think it's Luke. Yeah, there it is. Luke chapter 21, verse 24. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So you have this intermittent period. And if you remember, we'll get to this in the next video. In fact, I'm not even going to go into it. We're going to look at that, and it has to do with the 7 Mosaic feasts and this 2,000-year period from back at the temple being destroyed and Jerusalem being scattered to the rebirth in 1948. There's that period there that Jesus prophesies about, that Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. It's a 2,000-year period, and then Israel is taken back into the land, and they will be there until Christ returns. So I love that you're studying this with me. I hope it's beneficial. See you next time.